The message hidden in ordinary days. Most messages arrive in obvious ways. They appear in headlines, alarms, and urgent warnings that demand attention. But not every message is meant to be noticed immediately. Some are hidden inside ordinary life, disguised as routine, waiting for someone patient enough to see the pattern. Daniel never considered himself particularly observant. His days were predictable. Morning coffee, work by the window of his small apartment, the quiet hum of traffic drifting up from the street below. Nothing unusual ever seemed to happen in his neighborhood. That was why the first detail felt so easy to ignore. Every afternoon, the digital clock on his kitchen wall stopped. Not permanently, just for a few seconds. At exactly 3:17 p.m., the numbers would freeze. The blinking colon stopped flashing. Time itself seemed to pause. Then, after several seconds, the clock resumed as if nothing had happened. At first, Daniel assumed the clock was faulty. Cheap electronics often behave strangely. But after noticing the same thing happen again the next day and the day after that, he began to pay closer attention. It was always the same moment. 3:17 p.m. Nothing before, nothing after, just that 1 minute. A week later, another small detail slipped quietly into his awareness. Every afternoon, shortly before the clock froze, a dark blue car passed along the street below his building. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, like a driver searching for a specific address. Daniel only noticed it because he happened to glance outside at the right time. The car appeared at 3:16 p.m. 1 minute later, the clock stopped. Coincidences happen, he told himself. Cities are full of routines, delivery trucks, commuters, people following the same schedule every day. But 3 days later, the pattern grew stranger. Across the street on the corner near the traffic light, a man began appearing. He never walked anywhere. He never used his phone. He simply stood there. Every afternoon at 3:17 p.m. And each time Daniel looked out the window, the man seemed to be facing his building, staring upward with quiet, unwavering focus. Car, clock, man, 3 events, 3 minutes, day after day. Curiosity slowly turned into obsession. Daniel started writing everything down, recording the exact times of each event. At first, the numbers meant nothing, but after several days, he began to notice something hidden within them. The seconds. The car passed at 3:64. The clock froze at 3:7:15. The man lifted his head at 3:18:20. When Daniel began converting the numbers into letters, a pattern slowly emerged. Each day added another character, another fragment of a message, carefully concealed within ordinary moments. It took 23 days before the final letter appeared. Daniel stared at the page in disbelief as the sentence finally became clear. Don't trust the next memory. A chill spread through him, because every element of the pattern, the street, the clock, the corner, aligned perfectly only from his apartment window. The message had not been random. It had been meant for him. That night, Daniel went to sleep with the note still on his desk. The next morning, he woke to find another piece of paper beside it. The handwriting was his own. But he had no memory of writing it. The message contained only 3 words. It already happened. The first strange detail. At first, the detail seemed too small to matter. It was the kind of thing most people would notice once, shrug about for a moment, and then forget completely. A tiny malfunction in an ordinary object. Nothing mysterious, nothing worth investigating. Just a clock. Daniel had bought the digital clock months earlier from a small convenience store near his apartment building. It wasn't expensive. The plastic casing was thin, the display slightly dim, but it served its purpose. It sat on the kitchen wall where he could easily see it from the small desk by the window where he worked most afternoons. For a long time, he barely thought about it, until one afternoon when something strange happened. At 3:17 p.m., the clock stopped. Not permanently. The numbers simply froze. The blinking colon between the hours and minutes stopped flashing. The seconds no longer advanced. Time, at least on that wall, appeared to pause. Daniel noticed it only because he happened to glance up while stretching his arms after sitting too long at his desk. 3:17. The numbers remained perfectly still. For a few seconds, he watched the display, expecting it to move again. When it didn't, he frowned slightly, stood up, and walked into the kitchen. Just as he stepped closer, the clock resumed. 3:18. The seconds began ticking forward as if nothing unusual had happened. Daniel stared at it for a moment, waiting to see if it would freeze again. It didn't. Eventually he shrugged. Cheap electronics did strange things sometimes. Power fluctuations, loose wiring, minor defects. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. The clock probably just needed new batteries. By evening, he had already forgotten about it. But the next day, it happened again. Daniel was in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of water when he noticed the silence. Not an audible silence. Digital clocks make no sound, but the subtle absence of motion that draws attention when something that should move suddenly stops. He looked at the display. 3:17. The seconds were frozen. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the numbers jumped forward again. 3:18. Daniel felt a faint flicker of curiosity this time. Two identical glitches at the same time of day felt slightly less random than the first one. Still, it wasn't enough to cause concern. Electronic devices could develop patterns when they malfunctioned. He made a mental note to replace the batteries. But the following afternoon, something about the moment felt different. Daniel had been working at his desk near the window when he glanced up at the wall clock without really thinking about it. The numbers read 3:16. For some reason, he kept looking. Maybe it was because the previous two incidents had left a small question in the back of his mind. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Either way, he continued watching. The seconds ticked forward. 3:16:48. Then the minute changed. 3:17. And immediately, the clock stopped. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. The display froze exactly the way it had before. No blinking colon, no changing numbers, just 3:17, suspended in place like a photograph. 5 seconds passed. 6, 7. Then the clock resumed. 3:78. Daniel stared at the wall for a long moment. Now it was no longer just a random glitch he had happened to notice twice. It had happened 3 times, 3 consecutive days, always at 3:17 p.m. Nothing before, nothing after, just that exact minute. A small, uneasy thought began to form in his mind. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just curiosity mixed with the quiet realization that something, however minor, was repeating with perfect precision. And repetition, Daniel knew, was rarely accidental. So the next day at 3:16 p.m., he made sure he was watching. The second pattern. For the rest of that afternoon, Daniel found it difficult to concentrate on his work. The frozen clock kept returning to his thoughts, not because it was frightening, but because it was precise. Too precise to dismiss completely. 3 consecutive days, exactly 3:17 p.m. Each time the clock had stopped for several seconds, then resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. It was possible that the device had a manufacturing defect. It was possible the batteries were weak. It was possible there was some tiny electrical fluctuation in the building that occurred at the same moment each day. There were plenty of explanations, but explanations are different from certainty, and Daniel no longer felt certain. So the following afternoon, he decided to test something simple. At 3:16 p.m., he positioned himself in the kitchen where he could see the clock clearly. Instead of working at his desk, he leaned against the counter and waited. The apartment was quiet. Outside the window, the city continued moving in its ordinary rhythm. Distant traffic hummed along the street. Somewhere in the building above him, footsteps crossed a hallway floor. Nothing unusual. The seconds on the clock continued advancing. 3:50. Daniel watched carefully, curious to see if the strange pause would happen again. But before the minute changed, something else caught his attention. Movement outside. Through the kitchen window, he saw a dark blue car entering the street below his apartment building. That alone was nothing unusual. Cars passed through the neighborhood constantly. But something about this one made Daniel glance at it twice. The vehicle was moving slowly. Not in the hesitant way of someone searching for parking, but with a steady, deliberate pace. The car drove along the street, passed beneath his window, and continued toward the intersection at the far corner. Daniel followed it with his eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at the clock. 3:16:59. The numbers changed. 3:17, and the clock froze. Daniel didn't move. He simply stared at the display as the seconds stopped advancing, just like before. The same silent pause, the same frozen digits. After several seconds, the clock resumed. 3:77. Daniel slowly turned back toward the window. The dark blue car had already disappeared beyond the intersection. For a moment, he stood there thinking. There was nothing inherently suspicious about a car passing by at a particular time. In any city, hundreds of vehicles followed predictable daily routes. Delivery drivers, taxi services, office workers leaving at the same hour every day. Still, a quiet thought formed in his mind. The car had passed at 3:16 p.m. 1 minute before the clock froze. It might have been coincidence. In fact, Daniel was certain it probably was. But the next day, when 3:16 p.m. approached again, he found himself standing near the window without quite remembering when he had moved there. This time, he watched the street first. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the same dark blue car appeared at the end of the road. Daniel felt a faint tightening in his chest. The vehicle moved at the same calm, steady speed as before, gliding past the row of parked cars along the sidewalk. Sunlight reflected briefly off the windshield as it passed beneath his window. Daniel checked the clock. 3:41. The car continued toward the intersection. When he looked back again, the minute had changed. 3:17. And once again, the clock stopped. Daniel exhaled slowly. Now there were two repeating events, the clock and the car. They might still be unrelated. The world was full of overlapping routines. But repetition has a way of sharpening attention. Once the mind begins noticing patterns, it becomes difficult to stop looking for them. Daniel told himself he would observe for just a few more days. If the car continued appearing at the same time and the clock continued freezing at the same minute, then perhaps there was some explanation linking the two. Or perhaps he was simply watching too closely. Either way, he needed more information, so he began writing the times down. The car passed at 3:16 p.m. The clock froze at 3:17 p.m. 2 events, 2 consecutive minutes. By themselves, they meant nothing. But Daniel had begun to suspect that this was only the beginning of the pattern, because something about the quiet precision of those 2 moments felt incomplete, as if the sequence was waiting for one more detail to appear. The man on the corner. For the next few days, Daniel continued his quiet experiment. At 3:16 p.m., he made sure he was somewhere near the window. Sometimes he stood in the kitchen. Sometimes he sat at the small desk beside the glass, pretending to work while his eyes drifted toward the street below. Either way, his attention always returned to the same place when the minute approached. And every day, the pattern repeated. At 3:16 p.m., the dark blue car appeared at the far end of the street. It moved at the same calm, steady speed, gliding past the parked vehicles and storefronts below his building. The car never stopped. It never slowed. It simply passed beneath his window and continued toward the intersection. 1 minute later, the clock froze. 3:07 p.m. The digital numbers on the kitchen wall would pause for several silent seconds before continuing again. Car, clock, 2 events, 2 minutes. By the 4th day of observing the pattern, Daniel had already written the times down several times in a small notebook. He told himself it was only curiosity, nothing more. Humans were naturally drawn to patterns, even meaningless ones. But on the 5th day, the pattern changed. Or rather, it expanded. Daniel was sitting at his desk that afternoon when the blue car passed again. He had become so used to watching for it that he barely reacted anymore. He simply glanced out the window, noted the time, and looked back at the clock. 3:17 p.m. The numbers froze. 5 seconds passed. 6, 7. Then the clock resumed. Daniel wrote the moment down in his notebook the way he had begun doing every day. But when he lifted his eyes again, something new caught his attention. Across the street, near the traffic light on the corner, someone was standing there. Daniel frowned slightly. The man hadn't been there earlier. He was standing beside a metal street sign, facing the intersection. At first glance, nothing about him seemed unusual. Cities were full of people standing around for various reasons, waiting for someone, checking directions, pausing during a walk. But something about the stillness of this man made Daniel look twice. He wasn't checking a phone. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't shifting his weight or pacing like someone waiting impatiently. He was simply standing there, perfectly still. Daniel leaned slightly closer to the window. The man looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He wore a dark jacket and plain trousers, the kind of clothing that blended easily into a crowd. His posture was relaxed but upright, his hands resting loosely at his sides. And then Daniel noticed something else. The man wasn't looking at the traffic light. He wasn't watching the road. He was looking up, toward the buildings across the street, toward Daniel's building. Daniel felt a faint ripple of unease move through him. It was probably nothing. Apartment windows covered the entire front of the building. The man could have been looking at any one of them. Perhaps he was waiting for someone who lived there. Perhaps he was simply thinking about something and staring into space without realizing where his gaze had settled. Still, Daniel kept watching. The man remained on the corner for several minutes. Then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. Daniel told himself it meant nothing. But the next day at 3:17 p.m., the man was there again. This time Daniel noticed him almost immediately. The blue car had passed at 3:16 p.m. The clock had frozen at 3:17 p.m. And when Daniel looked out the window again, the man was standing at the corner. Same position, same still posture. Once again, his face was angled upward toward the row of apartment windows. Daniel felt his curiosity sharpen. 3 events: car, clock, man. 3 separate moments unfolding across the same narrow slice of time. He opened his notebook and wrote the new observation beneath the others. 3:16 p.m., blue car passes. 3:17 p.m., clock freezes. 3:17 p.m., man appears on corner. Daniel watched the stranger for several minutes. The man did not wave. He did not call out. He did not make any movement suggesting he was trying to get someone's attention. He simply stood there, watching. Eventually, he turned and walked down the street, disappearing behind a row of parked cars. That night, Daniel found himself replaying the image in his mind. The man's stillness, the exact timing of his appearance, the quiet alignment of events: car, clock, man. 3 details that might each be meaningless on their own, but together, they felt strangely precise. Over the following days, the pattern continued repeating. Every afternoon, the blue car passed at 3:16 p.m. The clock froze at 3:17 p.m. And somewhere within that same minute, the man appeared at the corner. Sometimes he arrived a few seconds earlier, sometimes a few seconds later, but he was always there during that brief window of time, always standing in nearly the same spot, always facing the buildings across the street. And after several days of watching carefully, Daniel noticed one final detail that made the pattern feel far less ordinary. Every time Daniel stepped closer to the window, the man's gaze shifted slightly, as if he had been looking directly at Daniel all along. The obsession. At first, Daniel told himself he was only observing. There was a difference, he believed, between curiosity and obsession. Curiosity was harmless. Curiosity simply meant paying attention to details that most people ignored. Obsession was something else. Obsession meant rearranging your day around the pattern. And Daniel wasn't doing that. Not yet. Still, over the following week, his routine began to shift in small ways he barely noticed at first. He stopped scheduling meetings in the late afternoon. He moved his laptop from the bedroom to the desk beside the window so he could work where the street was visible. And every day, without consciously planning to, he found himself checking the time as 3:16 p.m. approached. The notebook on his desk slowly filled with small entries. Short, simple observations written in careful handwriting. Day 1, 3:16 p.m., blue car passes 3:17 p.m. Clock freezes 3:17 p.m., man standing on corner. Day 2, 3:16 p.m., blue car passes 3:17 p.m., clock freezes, approximately 7 seconds. 3:17 p.m., man present again. Day 3, same pattern. Day 4, same pattern. At first, the notes felt slightly ridiculous. Daniel even laughed quietly to himself once while writing them. If anyone else saw the notebook, it would look like the record of someone documenting completely ordinary events. A car passing a street, a man standing on a corner, a malfunctioning clock. None of these things were mysterious, yet the repetition gave them weight. and repetition has a strange effect on the human mind. Once a pattern begins forming, the brain starts searching for structure inside it, whether structure exists or not. By the seventh day, Daniel had stopped writing only the minutes. Now he recorded the seconds as well. He positioned himself beside the window each afternoon with the notebook already open, pen resting against the page. At 3:15 p.m., the street looked completely normal. People walked past storefronts. A woman pushed a stroller along the sidewalk. Two teenagers crossed the street while laughing about something on one of their phones. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested anything unusual was happening. Then the minute changed. 3:16 p.m. Daniel watched the far end of the street carefully. A few seconds later, the dark blue car appeared. He checked the time. 3:16:04. The car moved forward slowly, its tires rolling smoothly along the pavement. It passed beneath his window with the same quiet precision he had begun to expect. Daniel wrote the number down. Car. Car, his eyes moved back to the clock. The seconds ticked forward. 3:59:55. Then the minute changed. 3:17. Immediately the display froze. Daniel counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The clock resumed. He wrote that down too. 2. Clock freezes. Clock resumes. Then he looked back toward the intersection. The man was already there, standing beside the street sign exactly the way he had every day before. Daniel checked the time again. The man tilted his head upward slightly, not dramatically, just enough to suggest he was looking toward the apartment windows again. Daniel felt a strange chill run through him. He wrote the number down. 3:17. Man appears. For several seconds, Daniel simply stared at the corner. The stranger remained perfectly still. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again. Cars passed through the intersection. Pedestrians crossed the street. The man never moved. Eventually, as always, he turned and walked away. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. Now there were 3 exact timestamps repeating every afternoon. 3:16:04, clock freeze. 3:15, man. 3 events. 3 times. 3 details unfolding within a single minute. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the numbers. At first, they had looked like random observations, but now that the list had grown longer, something about the sequence felt different, structured, intentional. He began flipping through the previous pages of notes. Every day, the numbers were slightly different. Sometimes the car appeared at 3:16:02, sometimes 3:16:06. The clock always froze at 3:17, but the pause length varied slightly. The man sometimes appeared at 3:07:12, sometimes 3:07:20. Small variations, but the order never changed. Car, clock, man. Daniel tapped the pen against the desk slowly. If the events were random, the sequence should occasionally break. The man should appear earlier. The car should pass later. The clock should freeze at a different time. But that never happened. The order was always the same, which meant one unsettling possibility was becoming harder to ignore. The events weren't just repeating, they were coordinated. Daniel felt a faint pressure building behind his eyes as his mind worked through the idea. If someone wanted to create a pattern that looked ordinary, they wouldn't use anything dramatic. No flashing signals, no obvious symbols. They would use normal things, things people saw every day: a passing car, a broken clock, a stranger standing on a street corner. Individually meaningless, but together, they could form something else entirely. Daniel opened the notebook again and stared at the columns of numbers. Then he did something he hadn't considered before. He circled the seconds. 04:00:15. His eyes narrowed slightly. Numbers, precise numbers. And numbers, Daniel knew, had always been the easiest way to hide information in plain sight. For the first time since he had begun observing the pattern, a new thought entered his mind. Not curiosity, not coincidence, but possibility. What if the pattern wasn't something he had discovered? What if it was something that had been placed there intentionally? And if that were true, then the real question was no longer why the pattern existed. The real question was much more unsettling. Who was supposed to notice it? Decoding the message. For a long time, Daniel simply stared at the numbers. The notebook lay open on his desk, pages filled with timestamps collected over nearly 2 weeks. At first glance, they looked meaningless, just scattered records of ordinary moments written in careful handwriting. But the longer he studied them, the less random they appeared. Patterns have a way of revealing themselves slowly, not in sudden flashes of clarity, but through quiet repetition that gradually forces the mind to look deeper. Daniel tapped the pen lightly against the page. 4, 5, 6. 3 numbers pulled from that afternoon's observations. Car, clock freeze, man on corner. At first, they meant nothing, but numbers rarely exist without structure, and when numbers repeat across multiple days, the possibility of structure becomes harder to ignore. Daniel flipped back to the beginning of the notebook. He examined the earlier entries again, this time focusing only on the seconds. Day 1 car, 3:16 and 2. Clock, 3:7 and 18. Day 2 car, 6:5. Clock, man, 7:11. Day 3 car, 3:6 clock, man, 17:20. Day 4 car, 3:7 clock, man. The pattern immediately revealed something important. The clock was constant. Every single day, it froze at exactly 3:17. Not a second earlier, not a second later. That alone felt deliberate. Electronic glitches rarely behaved with such perfect consistency. But the car and the man were different. Their seconds shifted slightly from day to day. At first, that variation had seemed random. Now Daniel wasn't so sure. He began copying the seconds onto a separate page. 02, 05, 03, 07, 4, 06, 01, 08. The numbers formed a short sequence. Daniel leaned back slightly, staring at them. A faint memory surfaced from somewhere in the back of his mind. Something from years ago, perhaps from a puzzle book he had once read during long train rides. One of the simplest ways to hide a message was to convert numbers into letters. 1 equals A2 equals B3 equals C, and so on. Daniel felt a small flicker of excitement. He wrote the alphabet down beside the numbers. 1, A2, B3, 4, D5, E6, F7, G8, H. Then he applied the conversion. O2, B05, E03, C7, G04, D06, F1, A08, H. He stared at the letters. B, E, C, D, F, H. They meant nothing. Daniel frowned slightly. Either the code was wrong or the pattern was more complex than he had assumed. He tried another approach. Instead of converting the seconds directly, he grouped them by event. Car times first, man times second. He rewrote the list. Cars 02, 05, 03, 07, 04, 06, 01, 08, man 18, 11, 20, 4, 15, 13, 16, 12. The second column caught his attention immediately. Those numbers were larger. 18, 19, 20, 22, 23, 20, 25. Daniel slowly wrote the alphabet again. 1, A2, B3, C4, D5, E6, F7, G8, H9, I10, J11, KL13, M14, N15, O16, P17, Q18, R19, S20, T. Then he converted the numbers. 18, R11, K20, T14, M15, O13, M16, P12, RKTN, OMPL. Still meaningless. Daniel rubbed his temples. Maybe the letters weren't meant to be read vertically. Maybe they needed to be combined. He began pairing the car numbers with the man numbers from the same day. Day 1, 02, 18, Day 2, 05, 11, Day 3, 03, 20, Day 4, 07, 14, Day 5, 4, 15, Day 6, 06, 13, Day 7, 01, 16, Day 8, 08, 12. For a moment, he simply stared at the pairs. Then something clicked. Not the numbers themselves, the positions. The clock froze at 3:17 every day. That 0 might not be meaningless. It might be acting as a separator. Car seconds before the clock, man seconds after. Left side, right side. Daniel quickly wrote the alphabet again, but this time he looked at something else, the difference between the two numbers. Day 1, 18 to 16. Day 2, 11, 5 equals 6. Day 3, 20 to 3 equals 17. Day 4, 14, 7 equals 7. Day 5, 15 minus 4 equals 11. Day 6, 13, 6 equals 7. Day 7, 16, 1 equals 15. Day 8, 12, 8. He converted those numbers. 16, P6, F17, Q7, G11, K7, G15, O4, D. Again, nothing obvious. Daniel leaned back in frustration. For several minutes, he said nothing, staring at the pages. Then his eyes drifted back to the original timestamps. Something about the minutes themselves suddenly felt important. But earlier in the week, he remembered the man sometimes appearing closer to 318. Daniel flipped back through the notebook quickly. There it was, day 3. He felt a sudden rush of realization. The sequence wasn't car, clock, man. The sequence was minute by minute, 3 team, 3 consecutive minutes, 3 positions in a sequence, and the seconds inside those minutes were the numbers that mattered. He rewrote everything one more time. 04D 15O 20T. Daniel froze. He quickly turned to another day. 14 N14 N20T. Not correct, but the structure was right. He kept checking, day after day, number after number. Slowly, the letters began forming fragments. DONTTRUS, Daniel's heartbeat began to quicken. He continued decoding the remaining entries. Each day added another letter. Each letter built a sentence piece by piece. 23 days after the pattern had first begun, Daniel wrote the final letter on the page. Then he read the message from beginning to end. For a long time, he didn't move. The sentence looked simple, but the meaning behind it made his stomach tighten. The message read, "Don't trust the next memory." Daniel stared at the notebook in silence. Outside the window, the street looked completely ordinary. Cars moved through the intersection. People walked past the storefronts. The city continued its quiet routine, unaware that anything unusual had happened. But inside the apartment, Daniel felt the unsettling weight of a new question forming in his mind. If someone had spent 23 days constructing a message hidden inside ordinary moments, if they had carefully arranged cars, clocks, and precise timing to hide letters in plain sight, then the message hadn't been random, it had been deliberate. And if it was deliberate, then it had been meant for someone. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes from the notebook. His gaze drifted toward the window, toward the corner where the man had stood every afternoon. The corner was empty now. But Daniel could no longer shake the quiet certainty growing in his mind. The message had been placed where only one person would notice it. Only one person had been watching the pattern every day. Only one person had written the numbers down, which meant the warning had been directed at exactly one individual, him. And the message wasn't telling him to look at the past, it was warning him about something that had not happened yet. The next memory. The full sentence. For a long time, Daniel did nothing except stare at the page. The notebook lay open on the desk, the final line of letters written carefully beneath weeks of observations. What had once been scattered numbers and meaningless timestamps had slowly transformed into something far more unsettling. A sentence, a warning. Don't trust the next memory. The words looked almost ordinary when written down. They contained no dramatic language, no explanation, no context, just a short message, simple and direct. But the way the message had appeared made it impossible to ignore. 23 days, 23 afternoons of small details repeating with quiet precision. A passing car, a frozen clock, a man standing silently on a street corner. Each event alone had seemed completely ordinary. Even together, they could have been dismissed as coincidence. But hidden inside the seconds of those moments had been letters. And those letters had been spelling something, patiently, one piece at a time. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the notebook still open in front of him. The apartment around him looked the same as it had every day before. The same small kitchen, the same desk beside the window, the same quiet afternoon light stretching across the floor. Nothing about the room suggested anything extraordinary had just been discovered. Yet Daniel felt a strange heaviness settling in his chest. Because once the message existed, it raised a much more difficult question. Who had written it? The pattern had required careful coordination. Someone or something had ensured that the blue car appeared at nearly the same time each day. The clock had frozen with perfect consistency, And the man on the corner had positioned himself at precisely the right moment for weeks. No one could accidentally create something that precise, which meant the message had been constructed. Daniel slowly closed the notebook and rested his hands on the desk. Outside, traffic moved through the intersection below his window. A bus stopped briefly near the corner before continuing down the street. A group of pedestrians waited for the light to change. Everything looked normal. Yet Daniel couldn't stop thinking about a single detail: the alignment. Every part of the pattern, the street, the clock, the intersection, could be seen from many places in the building. Dozens of apartments faced the same direction, but only one apartment had the exact angle needed to see all three events at once: his. From his window, the street below was perfectly visible. The corner where the man stood was framed between two lampposts. The path of the blue car ran directly beneath his line of sight, and the clock on his kitchen wall was positioned exactly where he could see it while looking outside. Daniel had arranged the apartment that way months earlier without thinking about it. Desk near the window, clock above the kitchen doorway, chair facing the street. But now the arrangement felt less like coincidence and more like design, because the message would only reveal itself if someone was watching from this exact position. Anyone standing on the sidewalk would see the car. Anyone inside the building would see the clock. Anyone across the street could see the man on the corner. But only Daniel's apartment allowed all three events to be observed together. Only here could the seconds be recorded. Only here could the pattern be discovered. Daniel felt a cold realization slowly forming in his mind. The message had not been hidden in the city. It had been hidden in his routine. Someone had known that he worked beside this window every afternoon. Someone had known that he would eventually notice the clock. Someone had known that curiosity would push him to start writing the numbers down. The message had been designed for a specific observer. Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the window. The corner was empty now. The man had not appeared since the previous afternoon when the final letter had completed the sentence. For weeks he had stood there every day, silent, still, watching. And now that the message was complete, he was gone. Daniel rested one hand against the cool glass of the window. A quiet question formed in his mind. Had the man known the message was finished? Had he been part of the pattern from the beginning? Or had he simply been another piece of the puzzle, following instructions he didn't fully understand? Daniel looked down at the street below. Cars continued passing through the intersection. Pedestrians crossed between the painted lines. The same ordinary life that had always existed outside his apartment continued without interruption. Yet Daniel felt as though something fundamental had shifted. The message was complete, but it explained nothing. If anything, it raised a far more disturbing possibility. Because the sentence was not about the past, it was not about the pattern, it was not even about the people who had created it. It was about something that had not happened yet. Daniel walked back to the desk and opened the notebook again. His eyes returned to the final line. Don't trust the next memory. He read the sentence several times, searching for another meaning. Maybe the message was metaphorical. Maybe it was simply a puzzle meant to provoke curiosity. But something about the precision of the pattern made that explanation feel unlikely. No one would coordinate 23 days of events just to deliver a meaningless riddle, which meant the warning had a purpose. And if it had a purpose, then something was about to happen. Something involving a memory. Daniel closed the notebook again and looked around the apartment slowly. Every object in the room felt slightly different now. The desk, the clock, the quiet afternoon light. They were all the same things he had seen every day. But suddenly he found himself wondering something he had never questioned before. If the next memory couldn't be trusted, then how would he know when it arrived? The final realization. That night, Daniel slept badly. Not because he was afraid. Fear requires a clear threat, something visible, something specific that the mind can focus on. What Daniel felt was different. It was a quiet tension that lingered just beneath his thoughts, like a question that refused to disappear. The message remained open in the notebook on his desk. Don't trust the next memory. He had read it dozens of times before going to bed. Each time he tried to interpret it differently, hoping that a simpler explanation would appear. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe it was a psychological puzzle. Maybe someone had orchestrated the pattern as an elaborate joke. But none of those possibilities explained the effort behind the message. 23 days. 23 precisely timed sequences. No one commits to that level of patience for something meaningless. Eventually, sometime after midnight, exhaustion overcame the restless cycle of thoughts. Daniel turned off the bedside lamp and let the darkness fill the room. The last thing he remembered before falling asleep was the faint outline of the notebook desk near the window. Then, everything faded. When Daniel woke up the next morning, the apartment felt unusually quiet. For a few seconds, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to recall what had been bothering him the night before. But his mind felt strangely calm, clear, almost too clear. He sat up slowly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft lines across the walls. Outside, the familiar sounds of the city were already beginning. Distant traffic, a passing bus, the faint voices of pedestrians on the sidewalk below. Everything looked normal. Daniel swung his feet to the floor and walked into the kitchen. The clock on the wall displayed 8:42 a.m., no sign of the strange freezing that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. For a moment, he simply stood there, trying to reconstruct the memory of the previous day. He remembered sitting at his desk. He remembered writing in the notebook. But the details felt oddly blurred, like a dream that faded quickly after waking. Daniel frowned slightly and walked toward the desk near the window. The notebook was still there, but something else was sitting beside it, a single sheet of paper. He didn't remember placing it there. Daniel picked it up slowly. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakably familiar. It was his own. Yet as he stared at the words, a strange sense of disconnection crept into his mind, because he had no memory of writing them. The sentence was short, only 3 words. It already happened. Daniel felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. He looked back at the notebook. The final page was still open to the decoded message. Don't trust the next memory. His eyes moved back to the new note. It already happened. For several seconds, he simply stood there, holding the paper in his hand. Then a disturbing possibility began forming in his mind. The message had not warned him about something that was going to happen. It had warned him about something that would happen before he realized it. A memory. Something he would remember experiencing. But something that might not have actually occurred the way he believed. Daniel tried to recall the night before in greater detail. He remembered going to bed. He remembered turning off the light. After that, there was nothing. No dreams. No fragments of memory. Just a blank space between midnight and the moment he woke up. His eyes drifted slowly back to the note. It already happened. A quiet realization settled into his mind. If the warning had been correct, then sometime between last night and this morning, something had occurred. Something important enough to require a message hidden across 23 days of careful signals. But whatever had happened, his mind had already replaced it with a new memory. A calm, ordinary memory of sleeping through the night. Daniel slowly looked around the apartment. Everything appeared exactly the way it should. The desk, the window, the street outside. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had taken place. Yet the presence of the note created an impossible contradiction. If he had written the message himself, then at some point he had known something. Something important enough to warn his future self. But that knowledge was gone, replaced, overwritten. Daniel folded the piece of paper slowly and set it beside the notebook. Outside the window, the city continued moving through its normal routines. Cars passed through the intersection. People walked along the sidewalk. The world looked completely ordinary. But Daniel could no longer trust the quiet certainty of his own thoughts. Because somewhere inside his mind existed a memory that did not belong there. And the worst part was, he had no way of knowing which one it was. The twist. For the rest of the morning, Daniel couldn't focus on anything. The note lay on the desk beside the notebook, the 2 messages facing each other like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Don't trust the next memory. It already happened. Every time Daniel tried to think about them logically, his mind seemed to slide away from the question. The thoughts felt unstable, like trying to hold on to a dream after waking. Still, one disturbing idea kept returning. If the warning had been correct, then sometime during the night, something had happened inside this apartment. Something important enough that his past self had tried to leave a message behind. Yet whatever that event had been, Daniel could not remember it. And that meant one of two things was true. Either the message was wrong, or his memory was. Daniel walked slowly through the apartment. The place looked exactly as it always did. The kitchen counter was clean. The coffee mug he had used the night before was still in the sink. The curtains by the window moved slightly in the morning breeze. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had occurred. Yet the absence of evidence didn't feel reassuring. It felt deliberate. Daniel returned to the desk and picked up the note again. The handwriting was definitely his. Not just similar, identical. The same slight angle in the letters, the same way the last stroke of each H curved slightly downward. But he had absolutely no memory of writing it, which meant the message had been written during the exact window of time the warning referred to. The next memory. Daniel sat down slowly and tried once more to reconstruct the previous night. He remembered turning off the bedside lamp. He remembered lying down. After that, nothing. The gap was clean and complete. No dreams, no vague impressions, just darkness until morning. Daniel's eyes drifted back to the note. It already happened. A new thought crept quietly into his mind. What if the missing memory wasn't just something small? What if it was the entire reason the message had existed in the first place? Daniel stood up abruptly and walked toward the window. The street below looked ordinary. Cars passed through the intersection. A cyclist rode slowly along the curb. Across the street, the corner where the man had stood every afternoon was now empty. Daniel watched the sidewalk carefully. For weeks, that man had appeared at almost the same moment every day, standing, watching, waiting. And now that the message had been completed, he had vanished. Daniel felt a faint chill as another possibility formed. What if the man hadn't been watching the building? What if he had been watching Daniel, waiting for the moment when the message was finally understood, waiting for the moment when Daniel realized the warning? But if that was true, then something about the timing made the situation even more disturbing. Because Daniel had decoded the message yesterday afternoon, which meant the warning had arrived just before the missing memory occurred, just before the event that had erased itself from his mind. Daniel turned away from the window slowly. His eyes moved across the apartment again, searching for anything that looked out of place, anything that might hint at what had happened during the night. Then he noticed something strange. The notebook on the desk had shifted slightly. It wasn't dramatic, just a small difference in position. But Daniel was certain he had left it closer to the edge of the desk. Now it sat farther back, as if someone had moved it. Daniel stepped closer. A quiet tension spread through his chest as he opened the notebook again. The page with the decoded message was still there, but beneath the final sentence, something else had been added. A line he hadn't written the day before. The handwriting was still his, but the words were unfamiliar. They had been written sometime after he had decoded the message, sometime after the warning had been understood. Daniel read the new sentence slowly, and for the first time since this entire pattern had begun, he felt genuine fear. Because the final line said, "If you're reading this, it means they made you forget." Closing question. In the end, Daniel never discovered exactly what had happened that night. There were no broken locks, no missing objects, no signs that anyone had entered the apartment. The city outside his window continued moving with its usual rhythm, completely unaware that something strange had unfolded within one quiet room. Yet the evidence remained impossible to ignore. Two messages written in his own handwriting, one warning, one confirmation. Don't trust the next memory. It already happened. And beneath them, the final line that had appeared in the notebook. If you're reading this, it means they made you forget. Daniel tried many times to reconstruct what might have taken place during the missing hours. He replayed the previous day again and again in his mind, searching for clues he might have overlooked. But every attempt ended the same way. The memory stopped at the moment he turned off the light. After that, there was only silence, a blank space where something important should have been. Eventually, Daniel stopped trying to fill the gap, because the more he thought about the pattern that had led to the message, the more unsettling one realization became. Whoever created the signal had known something very specific. They knew that ordinary communication would not survive whatever had happened. A phone message could be deleted, an email could be intercepted, a conversation could be overheard, but a message hidden inside daily routines, inside passing cars, frozen clocks, and silent observers, was almost impossible to erase. It existed in the physical world. It repeated itself patiently until the right person noticed it, until the message was decoded, until the warning reached the one mind that needed to hear it, Daniel. And that raised a final possibility that he could never completely dismiss. Maybe the message had not been created by someone else. Maybe the person who understood the danger first had been Daniel himself, a version of him that had already experienced whatever happened that night, a version of him that knew the memory would be altered. So he had hidden the truth in the only place it could survive, inside a pattern so ordinary that no one would think to look for it. Cars, clocks, a man on a street corner, all of them forming a sentence slowly enough that it could slip beneath the attention of whoever or whatever had the power to rewrite memories. But even if that theory was true, one question still remained, because Daniel now understood something that made the entire situation far more disturbing. If his memory of last night could be replaced once, then it could happen again. And if it happened again, the next version of him might not notice the pattern. The message might never be decoded a second time, which leads to a question that Daniel could never answer. But perhaps you can. If someone needed to warn you about a memory that was about to be replaced, a memory so dangerous that it had to be hidden inside ordinary moments, how would they send the message without the system noticing? And if the warning finally reached you, how would you know whether the memory you trusted most was actually real?
Share